Hello, good morning. Okay, so today I thought I'll talk about something very practical. Sometimes what I share is a little bit more on the intellectual and conceptual side because understanding is also important, like, frameworks and all that. But really, all of us are more interested, or I'd say even interested, in the topic of interior integration and healing because of the practical dimension. We want to know how we can live in a way that is more whole, more authentic, right? So I think many of us are aware, at least those of us who are interested in this topic even, are aware when we fall short. We are aware when we cause pain to others. We are very aware when others cause pain to us. And a lot of times, I think we struggle with, why is it that I'm in this same quarrel again? Maybe especially with our family members, maybe with our parents, and especially with our spouses, for those of us who are married. And sometimes it doesn't seem to matter, no matter how much we try to read about or learn about communication, about how we can maybe try and regulate our emotions better, like in the moment. All these can be helpful. But, those specific conflicts that happen in a pattern, like that, when I say happen in a pattern, I mean that it feels like we've had this same fight before, and we've had this same kind of fight before many times. There's usually something a little deeper about these conflicts. Okay, so I was talking to a friend just recently about thinking about doing a live sharing on current conflicts and how our current conflicts are, in a sense, primed by what happened to us in our past, by the memories that our bodies hold. And she thought it would be a very helpful thing for me to talk about. So, in part for her and also for the rest of us who struggle with this, what I'm going to do in today's sharing is I'm going to share 3 stories of conflicts, okay, from my own life. And it happens that these 3 stories are all coming from my relationship with my husband, but at different time periods. Okay, so we've been together for like 24 years now. Oh, seems like a long time. Okay, so I've been with my husband as a couple, including dating days, for 24 years. And so 24 years is a long time. And clearly, with me being on my interior journey at different points of my life, the way I've experienced conflict, the way I am able to respond during conflict has changed a lot. So I thought this would be maybe interesting for me to share some of these stories with you, because I bet you will be able to find something similar in your own life. Okay, if not with your spouse, it could happen. The same principle applies to any relationship. All right, because the link is between the conflicts that we currently have, especially the kind of conflicts we find ourselves having a lot, and our past. So, so I'm going to share the stories. I'm going to share each of the stories first, and then I'm going to maybe afterwards point out how things have changed. All right. And maybe even before I really do the pointing out, you may find you're making the connections. So usually when we fight with someone, or we think about when you get really upset in the moment with someone, you know how the emotion or the feeling is usually, there's fight energy, right? So usually you're thinking, what's wrong with that person, right? With the other person. And then maybe later on, you may think, well, what's wrong with me? Right? But it's always like, what's wrong with that person? What's wrong with this person? The energy is directed at the person who's upsetting us. And then later on, maybe we regret how we handled the situation, or we wonder, why is it that we always react so badly in this situation? And then it becomes, what's wrong with me? You realize that there's this instinct to kind of like find someone to blame, and to think that the problem, so to speak, is in the other person or in ourselves. What I realized, and what I hope today's sharing will help you maybe consider, is the problem may not be so much, in a sense, like in the moment, in that person, in the other person, or in ourselves. It could be a condition that we are already in for a very long time, that is priming us for conflict even before a conflict occurs. Okay, it's like we have entered a place where we are ready to fight, to get upset, even before anyone has done anything. All right. Okay, so the first story that I'm going to share is about my I think I was in my 20s, maybe my mid 20s. This was before I was married to my husband, and I was still studying in Canada at that time. And every year I'll come back for like summer break, okay, for like rather extended holiday back in Singapore, maybe 3 weeks at least. Usually maybe three. I can't remember now, but like, at least 3 weeks or so, maybe a month. And I think it was maybe the third. So we were long distance for like 5 years. And maybe it was like the third time that I was back for a holiday and then about to return to Canada on the last day that I was in Singapore. So that means usually that night I'll be flying back to Canada. And it's a long flight, right? It's like 22 hours, including transit. And I won't be coming back in a long time. So usually I will be bringing a lot of supplies, so to speak, back to Canada with me. I'll be doing quite a bit of shopping in the last few days leading up to my departure. And always on the last day, I will be rather stressed because, it's the last day, right? And I want to finish errands that I need to run. I need to buy the things I want to buy before I fly back from Singapore to Canada, where I was studying. And every time on this last day of my summer vacation before I fly back, there will always be a big fight between me and my then boyfriend. Okay. And on this particular fight that I'm remembering, I remember this particular fight well because it was so vivid. We had just done some shopping and we were actually sitting in his car in the parking lot of a mall. I think we have to go somewhere else, maybe for lunch. And we were raising our voices at each other. Well, I was really angry and I was crying. I remember I was so upset and I was crying. And he was upset and he was trying to figure out what went wrong. Like, what is it? How did we end up having this huge fight again? And then in the midst of our argument, something clicked in me. So this is something that's quite unique to me. Connections happen in my brain sometimes when I least expect it. So at that moment in the car, in this heated argument, and I remember it was a little bit embarrassing because there were people sometimes walking past us in the parking lot and they could tell that we were fighting. I was clearly crying. But suddenly it hit me that this is a pattern. That once again, on the last day of my time in Singapore, we were fighting again. And then I realized this is the first time I realized maybe what the trigger was, okay? So the trigger was my boyfriend at that time reminding me again, maybe for like the third time that day. This was around lunchtime, right? So in the morning, third time that day, that we will still need to visit his parents before I go to the airport. Okay, so it's kind of like that I still have to make a trip to his parents' place to say goodbye before I go to the airport. And that was like the trigger that I think at some point, like the third or fourth time he said that morning, that I lost it. And then it made me wonder, right, for a bit, like why was it that trigger? And I knew. So this was back then I suddenly realized this was a fight that my parents had many times over many years when I was a child. Not in this exact same context about, going away, but there was always this sense that there's a tension over in-laws, over priority of where time was spent. And as a child, I didn't fully understand maybe what was going on, but I was often present for the fights. And something about my boyfriend reminding me repeatedly that I needed to see his parents before I flew back to Canada, put me already in that state. It was like, I don't know, I suddenly felt all the anxieties and the fears that not just the fears that I felt as a child, but it was almost like I've taken on the anxieties and the fears that were in my parents when they were fighting. Okay, I may not understand what that was about, but I felt what they felt. And the moment something kind of like reminded me, not like intellectually, but emotionally, and I could say like maybe even now that I have the language of understanding the body and nervous system, something about this situation, this conversation felt familiar to me in a bad way. And so I came out swinging, I came out fighting. And I realized that for me, I had my own fear of abandonment. I had my own fear that if I marry this person, that our marriage will reflect and echo my parents' marriage. That I would have the same kind of insecurities, experiences, and fears that were present in my parents' marriage. Now, but for me at that time, just recognizing that this was actually about my family of origin immediately calmed me down, because I knew, already by then that, my boyfriend was a very different person. And I know that the person I was dating is not, it's not my dad. It's not, in a sense, that our relationship is different from the one that my parents had. It's not the same, right? So that helped me to calm down, and I could talk to my boyfriend at that time and explain to him, like why it was that I was so agitated. So he wasn't immediately comforted, because I think his concern at that time, we were both very young, was that he wouldn't know how to prevent something like this happening again, because he wouldn't know what my triggers are, right? But I did tell him, I think even then, that I don't expect him like never to trigger me. I don't expect us never to fight. But for me, it's more about that we can learn how to repair. We know when the conflicts happen, what we can do to repair so that our relationship can be a stronger one, right? But so this happened when I was like in my mid-20s, and already I kind of realized there was a link, right, to my family of origin. Now I'm going to fast forward, forward now to end of marriage. So this happened a lot in my 30s, okay, in my late 20s and 30s, in my earlier years of marriage. Whenever the conversation turned to finances, okay, turned to money, about how we're spending money, how I'm spending money. Okay, I think anyone who's married out there would know that finances is one of like the big triggers, right, of for arguments and quarrel and all that. Okay, and there can be many reasons, like different expectations and all that kind of thing about how finances are done or handled or managed. But there is an element that I think most conversations around conflict about finances don't cover. Okay, and so that's what I'm going to be talking about. Now, this is to the extent, right? One day I realized, and this is many years into my marriage, okay? So this is one of those things that had gone under the radar for very long. Like I didn't see the connection. I didn't realize what the connection was for very long. Or I should say, initially I thought the connection, why I get so upset when we had to talk about finances, was this sense of me being controlled, being told what to do, and specifically to do with money, and there were other insecurities that I had that I was aware of, and so I thought it was just that. Then when I started my work, like my recent work, so I started my own kind of like business, and my husband sometimes helps me with looking at the books, right? One day when we were doing that, and we had just barely begun, okay, we just sat down at the table, taken out our laptops and the required things. We just sat down, and I think my husband said something like, "Why are you snapping at me? Like, why are you already snapping. I was the way I was answering his questions was already very impatient. I was very terse. I was snapping at him. And I realized in the moment he was right. I was snapping at him. And again, like I said, we had barely begun. We just sat down at the table. And this time I realized that my body was already in kind of like fight. And again, the fight energy was there. I couldn't leave because doing the finances was something that we had to do, that I knew I had to do. So I couldn't leave the situation. I had to do this even though I didn't like it. But like every fiber of my being was like geared for conflict. All right. But again, in that moment, I didn't know why. I apologized to my husband. I said, okay, I don't know, I need to maybe back off and calm down, and calm down about this before coming back to it. So we managed around this. But a little later, I reflected again, I got curious. So important when we have these things that happen in our life that keep coming up, that we can be curious. Why does this keep happening? So I started getting more curious. Why is this, like doing the books or finances, something that's so triggering for me, that even before something actually triggers me, I already feeling, just the context is already triggering for me, right? The context of just having to discuss finances is triggering for me. And again, I realized, of course, that it traces back to, this is another one of those big things that my body prepares for conflict, because once again, this was one of the issues that was often fought about in my family of origin. And this isn't just, I think many families, right? So it isn't just my immediate family of origin. It's one of those things that's very dramatically fought about in the extended families in different ways. It's almost like there's some kind of trauma or traumatic memory around money. And so whenever just the topic comes up, I already feel unsafe. And this feeling unsafe, this feeling of being unsafe, I realized started when I was very young. It's almost like as a child, if I happen to overhear a conversation going into the area and the topic of finances, my body was already getting prepared for a fight or flight. Maybe even it's not directly at me. I was getting ready for conflict, to bear witness to conflict, to hear conflict. I wasn't feeling safe. So this is something that I later unpacked in therapy, financial trauma or trauma around the emotions of, on finances. And this is the dimension, I think, a lot of times when we talk about financial management, whether it's in families or our own, we don't really look enough at. Even here, there is actually a very emotive dimension. And if our nervous system is actually out of our window of tolerance, which means that if we are actually in a fight or flight, we're in a sympathetic state, our nervous system's in a sympathetic state, we're ready to fight or to fly, to flee, fight or flight, or we are in freeze, we can't think properly. It's just one of those things, we can't think properly. So if we can't think properly, how can we even, plan, let's say, financially and all that, right? So I'm just sharing from my own experience. For the longest time, I'm not regulated the moment I have to enter a context when I have to think about money and finances, right? Whether it's on my own or with my spouse, and which is why fights just happen very quickly when we discuss money. So that's the second story, right? How current conflicts tie back to the past. And for me, as I got more aware of this, it became a lot more helpful because I actually can plan ahead. I know if we're going to be discussing about finances, I know I'm going to be feeling unsafe. I know that I need to do something beforehand to get more grounded, and my husband understands this. So I'm blessed that I can talk, I can explain these things to him. And because he's also making his own journey, he understands, he has his own triggers, right? We know where kind of like the danger zones are, and we go slow, and we we do, like kind of like small steps, and we don't try to do anything regarding accounts or finances at the end of the day when we're really tired, because that's just asking for trouble, because we both know that our thresholds are a lot lower then, right? Okay, so that's the second story. The third story is actually very recent. Just happened last week, and it's also very illustrative, right? So for those of you who may be only joining now, I'm talking about how current experiences of conflict can actually be primed from our past, and how that awareness can really change the way we are in the present. So last week, we were in the car together. My husband was driving. I can't remember where we're heading to, but generally this period of time, like this couple of months, has been a time where it's been trying for me emotionally. There are things going on in my personal life, in my family, that are draining a lot of resources for me, emotional resources as well as physical resources. So I would say my baseline is already a little more, I'm more sensitized, okay? I'm more easily dysregulated in general. So we were in a car, and I was talking. So we were having conversation, and it was a normal conversation. It was actually a pretty interesting conversation. So I was in the middle of telling a story or something, or sharing something with my husband, and then he suddenly accelerated. Okay, so he was the one driving, and he suddenly accelerated, like it felt like very fast. I think he was trying to overtake a car or something. But it felt to me like in the moment where I kind of felt like, whoa, like what's happening? That felt unsafe to me. And then I realized I felt anger, like very angry. I was very angry at my husband for what he just did, even though it was just a short distance that he accelerated. We were, I think, trying to get on the expressway. So after we had the moment of like, whoa, like, like be safe kind of a thing, I tried to get back into the conversation that we were in. I was the one that was talking halfway, right? So I tried to continue sharing about whatever it was I was sharing. But even as I was talking, I could feel my heart was racing. My muscles, my back muscles, my neck muscles were tense. I was that anger that I was feeling in my body, it was still there. I was mad at my husband. Even though rationally, logically, I knew there's nothing to be angry about. I mean, we are safe, and I don't want to keep harping on this. But that fight energy was there in my body, and it wasn't being released. And it felt very very incongruous for me to continue talking about whatever I was talking about with this fight energy there. And I could feel that tension building inside me, So after a while, I just stopped for a moment, and this is something new or newer that I've learned to do with my husband. I just decided to just tell him. I said, okay, I'm actually feeling very dysregulated right now. I said just now what happened with the car when you did the acceleration? I said, I'm feeling very dysregulated right now. I said, I just need a moment. I can't keep talking. I need a moment to collect myself. And he was like, oh, okay, right. And so we drove in silence for a while. And I was just trying to be present and breathe. I wasn't even trying to understand what was going on, just being attentive to, I guess, my inner child. Like I was just trying to tell myself like, oh, it's okay. It's all right. We're safe, like, what's this about? Why are you so angry? What is it that's upsetting you so much? It was just my internal dialogue, right? I was just trying to be compassionate and kind to myself, to my body. And it took a while for the fight energy to subside, for me to be able to just thank my husband for his patience, and I couldn't immediately tell him what it was. But the anger that I felt in that moment at him for that speeding up subsided. And then we could continue the conversation that we were having earlier on, okay? So it wasn't till later in the day, sometimes these things, when we are making this journey of integration and healing, there's an ongoing sense of being present to ourselves, right? And sometimes things make connections happen when we are not explicitly trying to make the connections happen. So later on in the day, I think in that same day, at some point, it clicked for me. Another connection with my past, and now that I remember it, at the moment I remembered it, it became so clear. See, another place that often felt unsafe for me when I was a child was inside the family car. Because, and this is something that my brother and I, we've recently talked, and we realized that we both have different kinds of memories of feeling emotionally unsafe in the car. Because think about it, when you are in the car, when you're a child, you're in the back seat, right? You literally can't leave the room, right? When conflict happens, even if the conflict is not, the words may not be directed at you, you are in that space and you feel all kinds of things, right? And so for me, unfortunately, another place where often things become emotionally charged, when angry words are spoken, voices can be raised, both in terms of whether it's the parents in front who are arguing, or sometimes we getting scolded or me getting scolded as a child at the back seat. A lot of these memories take place in the car. Now, it doesn't mean that every time I'm in a car, I feel emotionally unsafe. So there are certain triggers, right? So one of the triggers is when someone gets lost, or like we take the driver takes the wrong exit or something, and then that often is a trigger for quarreling and argument. Another trigger would be when there is literally speeding, maybe some short burst of speed of accelerating, when one party, so we're talking about the two people in the front seat now. As a child, that'll be my parents, right? When one party deems the other person, like the driver, being unsafe, that the person was driving not safely, then that would often be a trigger for conflict, right? So it's almost like these connections are already made inside me, not even in my cognitive, like in conscious intellectual memory, right? It's not in my recall memory, but it's in the body, so when I'm in the car and the car suddenly speeds up like that, my heart rate immediately goes up. It's not because we were in an accident before. So I think if that had happened, that would be another reason why I would feel unsafe. But it isn't just it's not so much the physical safety that puts me into fight or flight. It's that sudden acceleration immediately prepares my whole nerve and my whole system for an argument. Okay, and feeling angry and blame. And it's like I'm spoiling for a fight. I don't know how to describe it, but maybe you may have experienced that before. You know how you literally just want to fight? you are spoiling for a fight to discharge the energy, and you're going to be unreasonable. Well, maybe some of us may not know that. For me, initially, at one point, I guess I didn't know I'm unreasonable. But at some point, even when I know I'm being unreasonable, it's like you don't care about being unreasonable anymore. You just need to say whatever you want to say out, right? It's an energy that you can't control. So for me, when I realized this connection, again, I know later on I was able to share it with my husband, and that is one of the blessings I have, because both Henry and I, we have been making our own journeys of integration and healing. We've both been revisiting our families of origin and our childhood, not to blame our parents, not to find fault with them, but to have understanding about why we are the way we are, why our capacities for love, why our capacities for regulation of emotion is as compromised as they are. We want to understand why is it that the kinds of things that make us go mad are the kind of things that make us go mad. The reason being, we want to be able to be more present to ourselves and to one another, to each other in our marriage, as well as with others, right? At work and with other people. So when I look at these three stories that I shared in today's live, I also look at changes and progressions in the level of my self-awareness, right? So for example, the first story I shared, it was like the third or fourth time that we had really big fights that I finally made the connection, right? That I finally kind of made the connection. The second story that I shared, it was it was something smaller. I think my awareness was really more developed that when my husband told me I was snapping at him, like, it's like, why are you already snapping at me? What it seems like every time we want to talk about finances or do our accounts, you're so irritable. That was enough for me to also realize, yes, there's a pattern. And actually, I realized that this was something that made me feel unsafe. And then finally, the most recent experience that I shared in the car, it was almost like I didn't even need my husband to point it out to me. It hadn't reached that point yet. I don't know whether he was aware. Maybe he felt a bit of the tension, right? That was in the air. Maybe he felt a bit of the tension in the air, but it was so soon. It was still happening. He hadn't said anything to me, and I was simultaneously aware as I was talking to him that there was this stress and tension and anger building inside me. So as you can see, there is kind of like progress in my awareness and progress or development in how I could respond. Now, why is this important? All the theory in the world really doesn't make a difference if it can't impact our relationships, right? If it can't impact our relationship with ourselves and our relationship with others. And sometimes I get really, really sad when I look at other couples that I know who have a lot of conflict in their marriage, and all they can see is the current problem. Is that all they can see are the issues with the spouse, which is normal. A lot of times it's not that the other person is blameless, right? But it's sad when they can't see that that's just the tip of the iceberg, that there are so many other things already contained within their system, the memories in their body, that in the first place prompted them to choose the spouse. Because even our choices of our spouse, especially if we're unhealed, there's something there that leads us to be attracted to a certain kind of person. Oftentimes we are drawn to the very kind of people that have hurt us. That sometimes, there's a saying, we marry our parent. Why is it that's such a saying? Because unfortunately, a lot of times exactly that is what happens. Even when we are aware that our relationship with our parent is very unideal, it's very, maybe there's a lot of conflict and there's a lot of stress. But when we haven't broken the cycle, when we haven't healed, it's almost like there's a part of us want to choose someone that's similar to our parent, and we're hoping that this time the story will end differently, right? So that degree of, our lack of awareness in our present sometimes prevents us from actually finding the healing that we need. And that is one big reason why when I'm accompanying people in difficult relationships, especially if it's in a marriage that they're struggling with, I always encourage them to seek out support for themselves, not even couples therapy, okay? Not even couples therapy, because the issue is not just about managing the relationship between two people, between ourselves and someone else. The issue first and foremost is to become aware of what we bring, the emotional charge that we bring, the fears and insecurities that we bring, the kind of things that we don't even realize we've inherited, that we bring into our new families, into our new marriages, into our work, the kinds of conflict that we have in our professional lives, or in church. It doesn't matter, as long as with other people. If you notice, if you become more self-aware, you might find that certain kinds of personality traits are particularly irritating and annoying to you, right? Or certain kinds of situations immediately put you at the edge of your window of tolerance. It's like just a little bit more and you're going to snap. There is a pattern to these things. Most people don't notice these patterns, right? But when we finally notice these patterns, it's very helpful to get curious, compassionately curious about why, right? But putting in now the God dimension, for me, I can't make this journey of awareness because there's so much fear in even looking at myself, so much fear in finding out that there's something malfunctioning inside me, that there's something wrong with me, that I can't make this journey of awareness without the experience of God's unwavering, unchanging love holding me. Right? So God's attunement to me in that sense is what has helped me over time feel safe enough to have that space to notice the patterns of conflict in my life and trace it back to the deeper wounds in my life. So this is still ongoing, people. It's still happening. And of course, I often say when I narrate these things to you, I'm calm, I can tell the story. I'm hoping that you can make the connection to something similar in your life. But we all know that as we're going through this, it's really hard. It's really hard, right? So that's what I wanted to share with you today. Kind of a very practical storytelling of how integration can make a difference to the way we live our relationships, how it can actually reduce the severity of our conflicts even, right? So most of the time we can't expect the other party that maybe we're in conflict with to have that kind of awareness about themselves. We can only try and manage ourselves, right? To be more present to our awareness. And even if we can't in that moment arrest the conflict, like we can't stop the conflict from happening, this awareness can go a long way when we seek to repair. Because when we become aware that a big part of the reason we fought or we were in conflict or we lost our temper had to do with us, we realize that there's something we can say sorry for. Right? I mean, there's something that we can genuinely seek forgiveness for because we also want to apologize for hurting the other person. And usually, for me at least, that helps me a lot with the desire to reconcile and feeling less defensive, because whatever may have happened, I can be very ready to acknowledge that I was already spoiling for a fight, for example, in these 3 examples that I gave, right? And it really helps me to work with my husband in a way that makes both of us feel like we are on the same team. So some of these things you hear a lot, you can read read often about communication styles, about, being on the same team fighting. When I was in marriage prep, all those years ago, there was this saying, it sounds kind of cheesy, but the saying like hold hands and fight. I don't know how many of you who are married, who've gone through marriage prep might have heard that before. We were told to hold hands and fight. Okay, it doesn't make sense. I mean, that literally doesn't work for us. Okay, when you're mad at someone, you don't want to hold hands. But I think what they're trying to convey is that we're on the same team. Right? And knowing that we're on the same team sometimes doesn't help because we really don't feel, in the moment, you don't feel like you're on the same team because all that anxiety and fear of abandonment that maybe isn't even yours. Like for me, I've inherited from those before me into myself as well. All that makes you want to survive, and that could mean fighting. But becoming aware that this is what I carry in me has helped me to not be so afraid when I'm going through these things, and to also help my partner, my husband, be less afraid. So both of us now are less afraid of the emotional charges that we bring. We're less afraid when we are in conflict, and we know what we need to do to get grounded again ourselves and to reconnect and repair. So I hope that this sharing has been helpful for you. And if there are any stories of your own that you can think of, I invite you to revisit those stories maybe and ponder what emotional charge might you be carrying from your past that was already priming you for the conflict that you are having. Okay, so that's it for today. Oh, you're so welcome. I'm so glad that you love this. Hey, Erica, I'm so sorry you joined late, and yeah, no worries. Please watch the replay, and if you have any comments or any questions for this, please ask. It was a very practical. It was a very, very practical session. Yeah, on integration. Okay, then thanks for watching, Grace. Thanks for being there. Yeah, and see you guys at another live next time then. Bye.